Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Peter Edson, and I'll be your sort of host and moderator today on behalf of this workshop titled From Open and Citizen Science to Activism, Roles for Academic Staff. This is an initiative of the Erasmus Plus funded INOS initiative or INOS initiative, and our sort of meta host, Katarina Zoru of Web2Learn, will explain the INOS initiative a little bit in her framing remarks that are coming right up. I'm a digital cultural strategist based in the US with a lot of work in Europe and around the world. I've been working in culture and civil society for 30 years. Most recently at the Smithsonian Institution as head of digital strategy, head of web and new media strategy, and then working with the United Nations to found a new kind of institution dedicated to catalyzing citizen effort towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So the idea that we should involve many people more forcefully, more actively in the work towards climate action and the SDGs has been something I've been struggling with, striving towards for quite a few years now. But I have to say that as a strategist, I've long discounted the idea that activism itself is a legitimate business or nonprofit strategy for our organizations. The events of the last few years, the acceleration of the climate crisis and the continued flattening of our societal response to it has just encouraged me even more to consider that we need dramatically more people involved. We need those people who are involved to use dramatically more impactful and dynamic means to catalyze large-scale civic engagement and really to drive change. It's evident that we're going to have to remake virtually every sector of society over the next 20 years or so to have a chance of even surviving through the climate crisis. And that's going to require some dramatically, if not radically, new kinds of behavior in every sector in society. With that being said, I think my education in this matter spurred forward a lot by some of the people in this room, and the work of Katarina and her colleagues at Web2Learn have brought me to the realization that I'm been educated and habituated to the thought that activism acts on a very narrow spectrum of ideas. On one side is passivity, just being a good citizen, voting, paying taxes, being well informed as a member of my society. And then on the other end of the spectrum is throwing bricks through shop windows and angry, violent protest in the street with almost nothing in between. And in these last few weird, awful years here in the United States, we've often wondered in my family, what's it going to take to shift people from passivity, paying attention, but basically working within the structure of society, and on the other hand, riots. What's it going to take to get people rioting in the streets? And what I've come to realize through the magnificent examples of the speakers in this you'll be hearing from, and the work that Katarina and our colleagues are doing, is this narrow thing is actually a false dichotomy. There's a broad and beautiful range of possibilities that are available to all of us to be more active in creating change in our societies. And in fact, the normal things that we do every day, go to work, be part of an organization, are actually a form of activism themselves. We're already activists. We're just activists in line with a certain way of thinking and organizing about the world. And we need to become activists in a slightly different one. So our goal for today is just to familiarize everyone with the idea that there are a spectrum of tactics that activists can choose from very gentle, very calm, very introverted, to very extroverted, still legal, or even, on the past the boundaries of what we would think of as legal into disruptive creative nonviolence. And you can mix and match and combine these tactics to create campaigns and movements to advance your goals. Our focus is within the context of higher education and also the workplace of culture, libraries, archives, museums, civil society. Everyone here should be able to find stories and ideas that match their circumstances. With that being said, we have 2.5 hours. We're going to go through one block of speakers and then have a short breakout exercise in which we'll ask you to get hands-on with some of the tactics of activism and the concept of activism itself. Then we'll come back as a plenary and discuss what we've just done. Then we'll have a second block with another group of speakers that will speak more about the climate emergency and creative nonviolence and the tactics and politics of being part of a workplace and a profession that's also driving change. We'll have another breakout after that and a chance to discuss. So we're governed by a code of conduct from Web2Learn, and Stefania will paste that into the chat now. It's pretty standard stuff, but if any of you have issues with fellow participants or anyone in the call, please reach out to a moderator through chat or call attention, and we'll come to your aid. We want you to roll up your sleeves and activate your brains and hearts, and also to kind of sit back and relax and learn from the wonderful example of the people here. A few of the speakers have told me that we're not prophets here, we're not experts, we're not gurus. We're co-creators here, sharing examples that have been useful to us as we've been trying to decide what to do and how to do it given the circumstances we face. So in that spirit of learning together and co-creation, I want to introduce our first speaker, Katarina Zoru, who will kick off the session by framing the INOS initiative. Go ahead and take it away, Katarina.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you, Michael, for being enthusiastic about that and combining your expertise in cultural heritage and the GLAM sector with activism more broadly. You're much more than a moderator for us, a facilitator. So many thanks for being insightful into what appears to be a huge potential of citizen engagement and social participation. This webinar is, this workshop is a follow-up event of a very successful webinar that we organized in July, in which some of the speakers today were also invited. And we thought that by expanding the July webinar, we could give more space for discussion and interaction to make action taking, including activism, stronger. A very short introduction to today's session from the perspective of the funder, which is the INOS project. Comes in a few seconds. Everything okay?
Looks great.
Okay, we'll expand a bit my July talk. Academic activism is something new, and this is a journey that I invite you to come aboard and discuss a bit stereotypes and thoughts about what academic activism is, the place of academic activism in society and in academia as well, and to discuss forms of activism, what it is, what may be not, as a demonstration of citizen engagement. Open and citizen science is very important from this respect, as a way of seeing the role of academia in society. There are many challenges in the context of contemporary societies: climate change, social injustice, biodiversity loss. So at a challenging moment for planetary health, science communication, advocacy by academic and research staff may not be sufficient to serve the change in these emergency conditions. My name is Katarina Zoru. I'm the head of Web2Learn, a digital education company in Greece, and one of the initiators of the INOS project. So I would like to welcome you also on behalf of the INOS project, integrating open and citizen science into active learning approaches in higher education. The scope of INOS project is to not only familiarize staff and students on open and citizen science, but organize practical workshops and initiatives like service jams, hackathons, democracy workshops, sprints, Fab Labs to make open and citizen science real at universities and beyond. And today's event has a double objective. First is to discuss forms of social action undertaken by contemporary academic staff. Can they help change patterns of social and environmental injustice? And the second scope is to question the role of contemporary researchers in action taking and in the translation of their scholar activity into real social action. Now, academic activism may be familiar to you or not, doesn't matter. Social relevance of academics comes to mind. We talk about science for society, science with and for society in Horizon projects, where the two terms have, 4 letters in common. It seems that there's convergence, but also some divergence in science serving society. Sensitive roles in academia, you can understand that have been pre-established. Being an academic staff that does not allow you to act as a citizen would imagine. So there are well-defined roles and norms, power relations affecting the academic job market. These are things that are at stake and things that we should discuss today. In the next 2 minutes, I will try to do something very, very quick and hope efficient, is to connect academic activism to open and citizen science, because open science has been thought or designed to serve better societies. So, and citizen science as a component of open science is made it has been constructed as a vehicle for a better world. So, citizen science is not new, has been established in the 19th century. So there are many, many initiatives, activities, methodologies of citizen science that can be very useful in understanding action taking and academic activism. So I would like to close with these points for discussion, and perhaps the power of citizen science data. There are lots of citizen science data sets produced. Up to which point of action taking can we go, and which form of action taking can we take around the rich data sets that are generated in citizen science projects? What kind of evidence we have, and how we connect the role of universities in non-violent civil disobedience, and how open and citizen science can really help us push the boundaries of empowerment, identity inside and outside the universities. That was all. Thank you very much. It's a collective effort, and really looking forward to the next talks.
Thank you, Katerina. That was great. And thank you, and thank INOS for hosting us today and supporting these tricky and important conversations. Let's go to our next speaker, our first kind of keynote speaker, Margaret Gold. Margaret Gold is the citizen science lead within the open science program at Leiden University and coordinator of the Citizen Science Lab, which is a project incubator and knowledge hub that brings together scientists, policymakers, citizens, and other stakeholders in participatory research projects that address scientific questions and urgent societal issues. Her primary focus is on citizen observatories and the impacts they have on monitoring the UN Sustainable Development Goals, national and municipal policy formation, environmental planning, social innovation, and behavior change. Margaret's going to speak for about 6 minutes. We have lightning talks from all of our keynotes today. The floor is yours, Margaret. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Gosh, I gave you a mouthful with my bio. Thank you for
excellent.
going through that. Lovely. So indeed, I'm leading the Citizen Science Lab at Leiden University, and also leading citizen science within our Open Science program. And this year, we're the European City of Science, which is where this lovely image with one of our QR code branding showing up behind the building, where we're bringing science into the city, to all of the neighborhoods of the city. And this is part of the conversation I'm finding myself in frequently this year as the European City of Science, but also my role in open science circles, where science communications or towards societal engagement as one of the UNESCO pillars is getting increasingly talked about. And I'm finding that a lot of people are still stuck in a way of thinking about science communication as a one-directional flow of information. And scientists are sharing so much knowledge about these crises with the world, and this is getting communicated. And of course, it's getting some backlash as well. But public engagement, it turns this into a much more two-directional flow. It opens up for questions and dialogue and explorations. And I know I don't really need to be telling it to this audience. Many of you are coming from the museum world, so you'll recognize this kind of example. This is a group of iGEM students who are showing people at the beer festival in Leiden, at one of our daily events in the European City of Science, how yeast behaves, how yeast grows. So at a beer festival, which is all about sampling beers, all of a sudden, lo and behold, there's a science table where you can take a look at yeast. Museums are brilliant at this kind of engagement with science. But and science communications can be genuinely quite powerful. There's an awful lot that scientists can do in communicating their science. And this is all valuable towards what we need to accomplish together. But we really need to go an awful lot deeper. And I quite like this image of the flow towards a much deeper engagement, where we're partnering with society, we're consulting with society, society is participating. And then that last bit is the kicker. We're doing together. Just to give you a quick snapshot of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about citizen science. Of course, it's a very broad field and it covers a very wide spectrum. But at its heart, it's any scientific process that genuinely involves participants from society as participants in that part of at any stage of the research process. So not just gathering data and analyzing data, but also setting the research agenda and also communicating the outcomes and turning that into actionable information. And this is the reason that we're talking about action, is because we need all hands on deck right now. And this is one of the things that citizen science can offer, that we're tackling these issues together with data that we're gathering together, but also insights that we have together. It's much richer picture when you know about what's happening in a specific place, in a specific context, to people facing a specific situation. Many of you might be familiar with this picture, which is Arnstein's ladder of participation, which describes deeper ways of of participating. It's framed in a policy formation context, but it goes all the way up to citizen control, citizen empowerment. This is a key part of what we're talking about in citizen science as well. And there's a really nice image coming from Citizen Science World, from the Doing It Together Science Project, which puts it more as an escalator, where you can be moving up and down with these layers of engagement, layers of participation. And of course, the ultimate layers are acting, having power to act, doing something. And this is translated into a little bit of a view of what does this mean for participation in science, where people engaged in DIY biology, synthetic biology, are in the thousands in Europe. But there's another framework that I'd quite like to give you, and this comes from David Armano, who's a leading thinker in marketing strategy, branding strategy. And this comes from a time when social media was well established and booming, and he was observing that people reacting to something by liking it on social media gave them the feeling of having taken action on the matter, gave you the feeling that you'd done something because you'd liked it, but it didn't necessarily translate to anything that was very meaningful. And he used the example of a mosque having burnt down a local community, and people saying, yeah, do rebuild it, we got to do something about it. But an action would be set up a funding page and start gathering funding to actively do something about it. And so he was talking about it in a social media context, but actually it translates to a lot of the things that we're talking about here too, coming from either an academic or any of the glam industry, communicators of science, public engagers with science. And there's two specific examples I'd like to give you. The first is a local example, the project Plastic Spotter. This started actually in co-creation with the city of Leiden. A big call for research questions was done, and one of the biggest ones that came to the fore was how much plastic litter is floating in our canals. We have the second most canals after Amsterdam. And so we worked with the Excellent Spotter On team and the Crowdwater app and created the Plastic Spotter version of this. And this is all in co-creation. And people got out and started mapping on their phone, where do they see litter? And it didn't take too long before that became a frustrating experience for them, because there was no guarantee that anything was done about that litter that they were reporting on. And it was the people participating that turned it into a much more activist citizen science project. So this is poster 1. Now I give you poster 2, where you see the emphasis is on the canoe volunteers. So every single weekend there is a Grachtwacht, the watchers of the canals, go out on the canoe floats. And not only are they gathering plastic, they're also sorting and assessing what's being found. And they're making reports to the local policymakers, one of which was a restaurants and cafes report of just about how many sugar sachets and menus were blowing into the canals. And what's interesting there is you know where that came from and you know where it's found. So all of a sudden we had policy actions. So this is the first example I want to give you of how citizen science can have very much an activist bent, actually doing something about the problem at the source. The second example I want to give you is one that I hope you've come across in your wanderings through citizen science, and that is SafeCast. And when the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened, there was a big groundswell of desire to do something, and a frustration that the official authorities weren't giving as much information as people wanted, probably out of a desire to keep panic down and make sure it was absolutely gold star quality data. But it didn't take very long before a group of hardware hackers whipped up their own little Geiger counter, and a group of software makers made a data visualization interface on the web. And this data quite rapidly became the most high quality and official data source in Japan for where radiation could be found. Completely self-started, and over time it has grown and has now become a much more official source. They've gotten ongoing funding and development and are now apparently a global source of data with this many engaging. But it was all in an activist impulse to take what knowledge you had to do something in the face of a disaster. So the things I want to leave you with these examples is actually a much closer to home example. This is a lovely example from The Conversation, which I hope you know about and read, of somebody talking about their research and their publications and turning that directly into what you can do. So based on their knowledge and study of how heavy rains are washing away soils, they're coming with a list of here's how you stop it. Here's a specific action plan of how you stop it. And this would be what I would turn to my science colleagues with a plea for. Wherever you see an opportunity to turn a piece of knowledge into a tangible action, here's what you can do. Here's ways to stop it. Here's what you can do. That would be my call to action to you. And bring it back up into the world of open science and the role that citizen science has in open science. I want to leave you with a completely different view of what open science means from a grassroots point of view. So it's not just open access, open data, but it's about the knowledge commons. It's about cognitive justice, environmental justice, all of these issues by empowering people on the ground, coming back to Arnstein's ladder and the escalator, empowering people in knowledge production and in scientific knowledge also empowers them to act. So as promised, I close with my call to action: act, but also have a call to action.
Thank you, Margaret. And your talk raises some really interesting questions about designing for action and activism at the beginning of the inception of new academic and scientific projects. I hope we get to that some in the Q&A and discussion with you. Thank you so much.
Very welcome.
Let's go next to Jérôme Santolini. Jérôme is the senior scientist at CEA and head of the Oxidative Stress and Detoxification Lab. He's co-founder of the Cantine Sans Plastique, an NGO that obtained the ban of plastic in food contact material in school catering and in maternity and pediatric services. Jérôme is a member of the Board of Sciences Citoyennes, an NGO engaged for 20 years in the democratization of scientific institutions. He's personally involved in the fields of research, public policies, open knowledge, and he has expertise in the accountability of scientists. Jérôme, he's also notes that he's helped to mobilize and promote the ban of nitrite additives in processed foods. That's a project that he'll talk about now. Jérôme, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Thank you and Katerina for having invited me to participate to this workshop. So a few minutes to share the slides. This is this one. Oops. Is it good for everyone?
Looks perfect.
Okay, so yes, I'm a scientist. I'm working on oxidative stress and redox, and I'm also engaged in a few activist initiatives that you mentioned, and I will shortly share with you this two personal experience of my engagement as scientist in the political field, which is the plastics and the nitrite. So the first one concerns the health impact of plastic in contact with food. I participated to the creation of Cantine Sans Plastique, that you could translate by no plastic in school catering, a French organization that unveiled the systemic use of plastics in cooking, warming, and serving food in French school restaurants. And we alerted on the massive exposure of children to carcinogen and endocrine disruptors. I was the scientist of the team. The knowledge was pretty simple. We could call that low science. The nature of plastic materials, the fact that plastics melt, that they liberate compounds that are major toxic chemicals, and that these toxics migrate in the food of children. That is a particular population particularly at risk. It was not my expertise field, but the job as scientist was pretty simple. It was just to diffuse and mediatize this common sense knowledge, to try to create some political leverage, and to seize the opportunities to force chance and luck on our side. And as you mentioned it, we were unexpectedly successful because under our lobbying and actions, a series of laws have been passed in France in the last 4 years that ban plastics from all materials in contact with food in school, but also in hospitals catering. The second experience deals with nitrite. So nitrite is a poisonous and carcinogenic compound. Though nitrite is massively used in processed meats such as bacon and ham, and guess what? Processed meat have been classified as carcinogenic for several decades by several international agencies such as the IARC that suggested nitrite to be responsible for the carcinogenic effect. That's a major public health topic. For example, in France, 2,000 deaths per year are directly imputable to the use of nitrite in processed meat. There was some political context at that time, some books and TV shows on the subject, and MP proposed to regulate the use of nitrite in processed meat. There was also a joint campaign of Food Watch, the Cancer League, Luca, to ban nitrite additives. And in that case, my action as a scientist was slightly different because it was my field of expertise. So I wrote a few papers to valorize the biochemistry of these compounds. I consulted the Cancer League and various deputies, and I participated to the expert committee of the Food Safety Agency, the French Food Safety Agency, that was supposed to rule on that matter. But in that case, that was a failure. So the nitrite bill was rejected, and I had to resign from the expert committee. So based on these two examples, I want to ask here the question is, why did my plastic activism work on, and why did my nitrite activism fail? So there are two ways to address this question. The first is looking from the science side. In the case of plastic, it was low science, as I mentioned. No controversy, no dead angle. It was simple and common sense knowledge that was really easy to share and to improve people's literacy. And this citizen science aspect brings empowerment of the people. The citizen knowledge becomes obvious and directly implemented the practices in everyday life. And public policies followed basically these common sense practices. That was not the case for nitrite. In the case of nitrite, it was really complex knowledge that I won't enter in, really hard to share. And I experienced also what I call the expert's curse, which is reflexivity. My relation to knowledge went through doubts, uncertainties, although it's not really easy, basically, to be an activist. And in that context, the scientific ethos somehow disturbed the political efficiency. From the political sides also, there were differences. In the case of plastic, some political loophole happened. Plastic pollution has been a major citizen and political concern over the last years, though plastic food contact material was no issue, neither for the government nor for the NGOs. And so the European lobbyists and the industrial stakeholders didn't pay much attention to what was going on in France. And when I did, it was too late, basically. The other thing is that the action started at the local level. It was an initiative from parents in a few cities, citizens, and they tried, in fact, to mobilize local expertise, and it was mostly a local issue, and before it moved to a national and political scene. And that was not the case for nitrite. In that case, it was already a central national issue with massive agro-industrial lobbying that has been for a long time engaged in disinformation and dysregulation of this economic sector. Numerous revolving doors and connections between the administration and the interest groups, and that forced finally science to become really negligible and only reduced as a political instrument. So based on these two illustrations of my engagement as scientist, I would ask a question again that we can perhaps ask later on, which is, if you would to engage in the fight against nitrite additive, how would you do? And thank you for your attention.
That is indeed a powerful question, and beautifully framed, Jérôme. And we have the luxury now, fortunately, of going into a period of maybe 10 minutes of Q&A with attendees here for any of the speakers or anything that's on your mind. And feel free to put a note in chat, and I'm switched to gallery view so I can see you if you start to wave your hands around. But let me begin by picking up on your closing question there, Jérôme. What is your intuition or your insight about choosing which, as a concerned citizen scientist, choosing which issues will yield easily to the arsenal of tools you have available to you and which will be more difficult, and then also how maybe to approach these more intractable, more complex, more politicized challenges, such as you described with nitrites. What is your intuition?
Well, the first thing is that you don't choose. It falls on your head, though. So that was the case for plastic. I'm just the father of two kids who went in school and were exposed to plastic. So I didn't really choose, and things happened by themselves. That's one. And we didn't really think about the tactics or how we should proceed. It just went on, and it worked. A posteriori, you could draw a few elements that explain why it worked. The fact is that we were a team. We were a team with different skills, different sensitivities, different issues also, perhaps, and that was really complementary. And in that context, that is necessary. You cannot just go as a lone shooter. And this is what happened to me in nitrite. I was basically alone. And that was not only a burden, psychological burden, but also that was the reason of the failure. If I had to be in a team as I was during the plastics story, I might have succeeded.
That's a wonderful response, and it I think we've been discussing among the speakers and panelists here, wanting to emphasize that idea that activism is a team sport. All of the stories of successful activism we know about may start with individual effort, but when you talk to activists in the middle or the end of their campaigns, they are extremely focused on the importance of peers and colleagues and groups. And I wanted to turn that into a question for you, Margaret. The idea of, in the plastic spotter example of residents gathering together in canoes and paddling together every weekend is very, very poignant. And I wonder if how much you feel kind of the camaraderie and designed fun of citizen science plays a role in sustaining activism and supporting these efforts over time.
In this case, it's absolutely key how fun it is to get out on the water in canoes with each other and be doing something good. That helps sustain a recurring level of volunteer activity, because it's maybe close to 700, 800 people that participate over the course of a year, but it's a small group of dedicated volunteers that are out there every weekend. And they're sustained both by the feeling that they're doing something about it, they're making a difference, and the pleasure of it. It is a fun activity, canoeing around the city. So that is key, and it's one of the concerns I have in the back of my mind, because it's got a beautiful team leading it at the moment, 2 PhD students who are actually being very activist volunteers and donating their own time to this every weekend as well, being the coordinators of this activity. There may come a stage in their careers that they're not able to sustain this themselves anymore. And what's that handover point going to be? Is it going to be a member of the volunteer community that takes it from there? I hope so. I think that might be the case. But these handover points are one of the things that citizen science struggles with, because we get funding for pilots and prototypes and such. And then we get these success stories with whole communities around them. And where does it go from there? So there has to be something sustained at the heart of it, and enjoyment and camaraderie, community. That's a big piece of it.
Where does, and actually for both of you, Margaret and Jérôme, does the institution, I'm using finger quotes, the university, the citizen science lab, your department, have a responsibility to spark and then sustain these citizen activist groups over time? Or is it enough to just start them up and walk away?
No, I think you can't do the latter. If you're helping doing the sparking, then there's an implicit promise in that. And citizen science itself, I usually describe as being an implicit promise that you make. If you're inviting people to get involved because their volunteered effort is valuable, then you have to show that value at the end too. It has to have some real impact somewhere, even if it's just new knowledge, but ideally it leads to something.
Jérôme, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do not fully share this view, because the institution and the individuals may not share exactly the same purpose or stakes on different matters, and sometimes they might even oppose on a few issues. That was not the case for plastics or nitrite in my case, but my institution is not really engaged. It's not its purpose to engage in the regulation of nitrite in food or in the removal of plastics in the ocean. That's not what it has been designed for. So that's another issue, and I'm sure we should push for the institution, for the responsibility and the accountability of the institution themselves even in the contract they have with their with the government or their financial supports. But at that time, it's just cosmetic, and you have to work on your own.
Well said, both of you. And I think this certainly forefront of my mind as a member of the cultural sector working with a lot of organizations is exactly this dynamic of the institutions not being set up to be able to easily conceive of themselves as having agency and social responsibility to take and support action.
Yeah, I should say that I don't disagree with Jérôme. We kind of operate as a bit of a skunk works within the university. The university itself as an institution wouldn't be able to offer that kind of ongoing commitment. That's true.
If I may add, another thing is that a lot of companies are engaged in social and environmental responsibility. They have department and all that stuff, which is not the case for the research or teaching institution, which is kind of surprising.
I'm just going to, I'm sorry, Giuseppe, were you raising your hand? Okay, back to you when you have the floor later. I think I just want to read a comment from Alice Shepard in the chat. And then Stefania, are you ready for us to go to you in a moment? Okay, good, thumbs up. Alice Shepard in chat says it's really important for citizen scientists to be able to meet if possible, or at least to talk to each other, have some fun. I recommend to anyone running a project that they provide an online discussion forum and allow for a section for fun, irrelevant chat. A community is a huge reason why people stay in a project. Thanks for that, Alice. And I'm remembering a recent interview with Greta Thunberg saying that her big discovery of becoming an activist is really the beautiful friendships that she's made in that process that sustains her. This Q&A is too brief always. We'll be back to you and the other speakers throughout the day. Now we want to transition a little bit into, to step back a moment and look at the idea that there's a theoretical or a framing underpinning for kinds of activism. I'll put it crudely there and let Stefania pick up with a short talk about the research that she's doing with Web2Learn and INOS. Stefania Oikonomou works as a researcher at Web2Learn. She explores social participation and active citizenship through digital action activities. She's particularly interested in researching bottom-up and citizen-led digital action for social purpose. Stefania, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone. I think you can see my slides and hear me well.
Yes, sounds great.
Great, so hello everyone, I'm Stefania Oikonomou and I'll briefly introduce you to this ever-growing social phenomenon of activism in our contemporary societies. So, as it has been beautifully pointed out from previous speakers, activism does not imply a single form of action taking. In fact, being an activist usually entails being engaged in various ways in a cause that you value most. Activism can be expressed through the adoption of environmentally conscious lifestyles on individual level, or through organizing awareness-raising campaigns or litter-picking activities with your friends, or participating in public assemblies in your community. But how should we approach activism? Well, generally speaking, activism is a very broad and complex phenomenon that can be seen from different angles. In fact, there are several disciplines that are interested in understanding how activism works. These disciplines can be political science, science and technology studies, sociology, the learning sciences, the internet studies, information and communication studies, just to name a few. There are also numerous methodological tools, frameworks, and approaches that shed light on this multifaceted phenomenon. Therefore, it is very ambitious to claim that we have a fair understanding of what activism is. Some research angles that shape our understanding of activism are the degree of engagement, motivations, how individual and collective participation is being displayed, which digital tools are used, and what is the desired impact. We thus propose a more creative way of understanding activism as a constellation of individual and collective actions that seek to foster change on personal, professional, and institutional level. According to this understanding, we should avoid treating activism like a black or white dilemma. This Manichaeistic view is in contrast with the multicolor identity of activism, its many forms, and the people who are engaged in it. In addition, to take action and demand change is indispensable in times of crisis. It has been like that throughout human history. In fact, action taking has helped humans survive in a constantly changing environment. So having said that, you should always bear in mind that it's up to you to decide the goals and limits of your action taking based on what, according to your needs. This way, it is evident that the spectrum of the various forms with which activism is manifested has been expanded to include more people, diverse personalities, and different worldviews. Moreover, what comes out from our discussions with people engaged in activism is that action taking usually combines a variety of forms, just like a palette containing different colors. For example, if you want to take action to reduce plastic waste, you would consider a number of diverse options that put together can effectively convey your message and result in desired change. You'll need volunteers, communication campaigns, online platforms, and public gatherings as well. So finally, it is time to question our own beliefs about activism and break down past prejudices and stereotypes. We should look at activism as a dynamic process, full of ups and downs, able though to generate new perspectives, especially in times when we think that everything is lost. Activism is also a learning trajectory, both for people directly or indirectly connected with it, and a great opportunity to build community engagement in a fragmented world. So beyond the need for more action taking for environmental or social issues, we take this workshop as an opportunity to urge for more scholarly research on this vivid topic. I do believe that academics should dedicate more time to study activism from a scholar perspective. And into this direction, there is a forthcoming paper that is in preparation, and I would personally be interested in connecting with scholars and researchers that conduct research on activism. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was great, Stefania. Thank you so much for that. And that leads beautifully into our first breakout room. And we're going to start with Gianluca Grimalda and then go to Giuseppe Dalmestri and then Laura Horn and go more into the thought process of, I would say, large-scale activism, particularly around climate and extinction issues. So let's start now with Gianluca. Gianluca Grimalda is senior researcher at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. He's a social scientist interested in the psychological and cultural basis of social cohesion with application to climate change. He's the coordinating author in the International Panel on Social Progress. He's chair and contributor to the Task Force on Social Cohesion in the Think 20 network that provides policy advice to the G20 annual meeting. His research has been published in PNAS, Nature Communications, Psychological Science, and Experimental Economics. Gianluca, the floor is yours, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. So let me start my presentation. Okay, so I hope you see it now on the screen. Yeah, okay. So I have been tasked with the very difficult job of giving you some basic principles on the foundations of civil resistance, some, again, basic insights into the empirical analysis of how effective civil resistance is. And then if time allows, I would just like to talk about one action that I have carried out that shows in a way how one can be creative and hopefully effective at the same time. So I warn you, this is going to be a roller coaster because there are a lot of things that could be said about these themes. So I will, of course, be very, very superficial. I would just try mainly to give you some input, some ideas for developing more food for thought later on. So let me start with something that really is not really the main topic of this talk, but I think we need to talk about the physics of climate science to really make a case for the urgency and for the, I would say, the need to engage into civil resistance. So I could, in a way, I could have shocked you with the many different images, but this is the one that, at least to me, is the most shocking one in the work on climate change that I have seen. So this is the map of the world in 2070, and the black areas denote the areas in the world in which the average temperature over the year will be in the region of 29 degrees Celsius. And this is a level that is considered to be simply impossible for human beings to survive. So if we go on with the standards, with business as usual, it is very likely that all the areas that you see here marked in black, so for instance, India, Southeast Asia, Africa, Brazil, will be uninhabitable. And there is also going to be a process of salinization, so there will be also a problem of food access. So we can think that people who are lucky enough to live in the areas that are not affected by such extremes in temperature rises will be exposed to massive migratory pressures. So according to some demographers and climate scientists, already by 2050, people living in Europe and in Northern America, particularly the US, will be exposed to migratory pressures in the order of 100 million of people. And we have already seen that the migration from areas exposed to war, like Syria, that counted for not more than 3-4 million people at the most, already created a big political shift in the political spectrum. So just imagine what the migration of hundreds of millions of people will mean for our societies. And of course, I could say more about also the physics, how there are really carbon bombs that are really, really frightening. But I have short time, so let's go on with exploring the alternatives. So what can we do? And this is a line that I have constructed. I think it's in a way similar to the line that we have seen in the breakout session. But this goes more towards the civil disobedience side. So we have talked about activism before. So in a way, activism for most of the tactics that we have seen tends to stay within the boundaries of the law. Instead, the civil disobedience, by its very definition, implies breaching the law, breaking a law. So here in this line, I have represented this idea with this red line associated with the law. So we can have a lot of legal protests, petitions, writing letters, marches, etc., that are truly legal. Civil disobedience, by definition, implies some breaching of the law. And in the most typical case, this is done because this is done out of conscientiousness, because people realize that some activity by the government, some policies, some law goes against the dignity or infringes on the human rights of the people, and therefore it's necessary not to obey this law. So the most typical cases are the Jim Crow regulations in the United States leading to segregation of Black people, the law, the SALT laws in India under the colonial rule by the British Empire. So according to the definition by John Rawls, who was one of the most prominent political philosophers in the 20th century, what really defines civil disobedience is an action that has these characteristics: is public, non-violent, conscientious, and implies the breaching of the law. And then, of course, we can have other kind of actions that are not, strictly speaking, civil disobedience. We have uncivil disobedience, militant protest, organized forcible resistance up to revolution. And let me talk a little bit more about civil disobedience. And here, of course, each of these aspects could be worth a lot of discussion, but let me be selective and just emphasize some of them. So the first aspect of civil disobedience is that it has to be somehow principled. So typically one does not go into civil disobedience to, let's say, increase their own wealth. So there must be, at least in principle, the idea that we act for civil disobedience for a public cause, for something that it's really in the interest of the community. Although it is also fair to say that in some cases, like the ones that I have cited before, civil disobedience was clearly directed to the welfare and the dignity of very specific minority groups, like Black people in the US. So, for instance, it is discussed whether actions like not in my backyard are justifiable, are classifiable as civil disobedience or not. I think another aspect that I would like to stress, according to this definition, is that civil disobedience should be communicative. So the idea is that the people who get into action want to launch a message to the community. So, for instance, private boycotting is not civil disobedience per se, precisely because it lacks this aspect of being public and being communicative. And there is also, of course, a big discussion also on the extent to which violence and property damage can be tolerated or not. And of course, I think everybody would agree that inflicting physical harms to other people has to be absolutely considered as violence, so not falling under civil disobedience. But for instance, the coercion limiting the freedom of movement, the freedom of space of others can also be considered by some as a form of violence. So it's to some extent controversial whether forms like roadblocks are coercive or not. And then there is also the big theme, I think it's particularly relevant for the climate movement. Do we want to persuade or do we want to coerce? So of course, a persuasion would be ideal. But yeah, we have seen with the vaccinations with COVID that there is going to be a large minority of the population who is not going to accept coercion. And I think this is particularly relevant with the climate movement because we really would like, we are talking about a transformational change that should be, in principle, be universal. So having 30% of the people who don't accept the action of the majority, the demand by the majority to stop with CO2 emissions, for instance, would just be too much. So I suppose that some forms of coercion is really necessary for decarbonization. Then there is also the aspect of the justification that I will briefly touch upon in my last slide on this section. So I just wanted to mention that there has been a kind of a turnaround in the justification of disobedience. So a more traditional approach would say that it is a moral duty to obey the law. And on the basis of this approach, civil disobedience would be presumptively wrong. So it would be very difficult to find some moral grounding for civil disobedience. But recently there has been a kind of anarchist turn. So more and more political philosophers have been skeptical towards this idea. And basically, a completely different idea has emerged more recently. And this idea is that the very same basis that in the past would urge emerge political philosophers saying that it is a moral duty to obey the law. Now, this same basis lend support to the idea that we have a duty to resist injustice through civil and civil disobedience. So in a way, the burden of the proof is completely reversed. So people say that, scholars say that it's really the duty of citizens to resist injustice. Don't have time to talk about examples of past movements. So in the remaining 2 minutes, I understand that I probably already exceeded my time.
No, you're good, Gianluca.
Okay, I just wanted to talk about some evidence of social protest effectiveness. And there has been a beautiful review by the Social Change Lab about analyzing the existing studies and existing literature on the effectiveness of a social protest. And you can assess the effectiveness under 3 domains: public opinion, voting behavior, and politicians' behavior. And just to go straight to the conclusion, so there is, I would say, converging evidence, so we can say with high confidence that social protests have a positive impact in orientating public opinion. So this is a graph, for instance, taken from the civil rights movement. And you can see that as a consequence of protests like bus boycotts, freedom rides, of the civil rights movement, there has been almost automatically, like a knee-jerk reaction, there has been a big rise in the public attention for racism in the US. So you can see that, I mean, it's really incredible. So the Birmingham campaign led to an increase from less than 10% in people saying we have a race problem in the US to 52%. So that's a massive change. But you can also see how, in a way, the interest in the race issue, it was really short-lived. So after the action, the concern for the objective of the action decreased very fast. And now look at a very similar graph that has been done for Extinction Rebellion. So, of course, it's very difficult to ascertain causality because there can be a lot of factors that can affect public opinion. But look at what happened here. So look at what happened in 2014. So we had winter storms and flooding. I think, yeah, this refers to the UK. So there was, again, a big peak in concern for the environment, and then that was short-lived. But look at what happened in 2019 with the first extinction campaign in London. So we can see that there was a large increase in public concern with the environment, and that has remained stable over the years. So it has never gone down, of course, with some fluctuations. So I think that's telling. That's the result from a study by, again, Social Change Lab about the impact of the Just Stop Oil campaign, which maybe we will talk about later. So here, I would say the conclusions that we can draw. So the survey asked the people whether they were going to take, they were likely to take some climate action in the next 12 months, and whether they were likely to contact an MP about climate change before, during, and after the protest. And here, if you use the magnifier, you can see that there has been a small but positive change in the willingness to engage into these forms of public action by people who were exposed to the Just Stop Oil campaign. So we're talking about maybe a shift of 2% in consensus, but yeah, 2% over a population of millions of people can really mean a lot. This is impact of a civil rights movement on voting. I think this is a very interesting study. This was published on a top economic journal. So I think it's really, really, yeah, we can trust these results with a high confidence. And they use the sophisticated statistical techniques to really be able to say that what we find is causal. And the main conclusion is that having non-violent protests in your area linked with the civil rights movement in the US led to a significant increase in the share of the votes going to the Democratic parties in the US elections, but only if protests were non-violent. Violent protests had the opposite effect. Violent protests reduced the share of the votes for the Democratic Party. And exactly the same happened with the Tea Party rallies in 2009. So if in your area there was a Tea Party rally, there would be a higher share of the votes going to the Republicans. There is also some evidence, but at this time there are some studies who don't find conclusions with the same strength about the impact of protests on legislation. But again, it's very important also the type of protest. We don't have a lot of evidence. Actually, we have hardly any evidence on whether doing disruptive action pays off or not. We have one experiment, so this is just one survey experiment. It's not real life data. But what this experiment shows is that if people are exposed to disruptive anti-Trump protests, they have the effect of increasing support to Donald Trump. Whereas moderate anti-Trump protests have a very mild, very minor effect on reducing support for Donald Trump. So yeah, these are my conclusions. Social protest has positive impact on public opinion. I think there is a little doubt about that, but this could be small. And we still know very little about the effectiveness of the type of action that is taken on whether it is effective or not. But the little evidence we have is that we have to be careful with the actions that are too disruptive. And then maybe in another occasion, I will talk about my own actions in which we tried to combine art. So we organized a theater act in order to show the dramatic events of the Ukraine war, in which clearly paying for Russian gas was associated with the war, with quite a disruptive blockade of the plant of energy giant Eni in Italy, in which we tried to combine actions that were less disruptive with the more disruptive actions, and we also had to engage with the not so pleased workers of the plant. But yeah, enough what I said before, and sorry if I took too much of your time.
No, Gianluca, we asked you to take on a gigantic task here, and thank you so much for stepping up to it. That was a tremendous talk, and I do want to hear that story. I think everyone will want to hear that story, but let's queue it up maybe for the question and answer period once we've had a chance to hear from Giuseppe and Laura. So thank you very, very much for that. Take a bow. Deep breath, and then let's shift on to our next keynote speaker. Giuseppe Dalmestri got his master's in business administration in Milan and his PhD in economic and business science in Mannheim. Since July, he's chair of the European Group of Organization Studies. He's elected with a program of greening the association. He studies processes of social evaluation like status contests and stigmatization in markets, organizations, and social movements. As an activist, he co-founded the organization Scientists for Future and participated in activities and actions of Extinction Rebellion Austria and Scientists for Future Austria. Giuseppe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mike. My presentation will be mostly a description of what I did without much theory of if it works or not, but I'm open to any questions. It's concentrated not only in Austria but in Europe. The picture you see here is Fridays for Future that I took in front of the Austrian parliament. So first of all, at some point a couple of years ago, I realized about my own footprint, the footprint of academia. One of my most important papers that you see on the left, at some point I was thinking how many travel I had to do to get to my co-author Royston Greenwood in Canada. And I calculated about 20 or 25 tons of CO2 were implied in publishing that paper. Also, as a university professor, organized so-called boarding pass or exchange of students using even the image of an airplane. And more recently in Austria, I also created Master in Global Business, where students travel in 3 continents. So the impact, I realized the impact of my activity in terms of greenhouse gases footprint was huge. And at some point, I came to the realization that I had to do something. And in 2018, I had the opportunity to have 1 year of sabbatical, and I decided to make out of it a sub-bicycle, so a sabbatical on the bike. It was more a very spontaneous action out of this feeling uncomfortable of not doing enough. Yeah. Before that, I already just turned vegan, organic, all this typical consume is not real activist, but a way of convincing yourself that you're doing something. But then I realized probably I don't do it enough. Yeah. And this was a kind of symbolic action, you know, to take the bike, go to conference, visit colleagues in other universities on the way, both in the winter and in the summer, with the idea to do something symbolically out of it as an individual. No, this was not the team activity. But when I reached Tallinn by bike to our main conference in organizational studies, people had followed me on Twitter, and I realized there were several a kind of Forrest Gump moment where fortunately colleagues and younger colleagues of mine said, this is great, we have to do something. And so the next year, starting from that, we started to organize a group which is called Organization Scientists for Future. And our action, and let me go immediately to that. So the teams came in, people convincing me that it's not enough to do individual work, but is to do something collectively. And we organized the activity Egos by Train. Egos is the name of the conference. So we organized pre-conference activities on trains in order to convince especially younger scholars to not to take the plane. Yeah. And this grew so that Organizational Scientists for Future became a relevant actors in my discipline, at least. Yeah, now we have 1,200, more than 1,200 followers on Twitter, all academics, and a couple of us were, thanks to these activities, also elected in the board of the Scientific Association of EGOS, this European Group of Organizational Studies, with the clear democratic mandate to do something about it, no? Not just flying around and assuming that what we do as academics is so important that we don't need to reduce our own footprint. Yeah, this is a challenging task because conferences are important to have exchange of idea, and what I say now as the chair of this organization is that we have to combine the reduction of footprint with maintaining a mind print of the conference. But parallel to that, I also got in contact. Sorry, I have to take out my right now my headphones.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, just make sure you project.
Sorry. My headphones. Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great, thank you. Yeah, and I got in contact with Extinction Rebellion in Austria. And as also Gianluca said, we were involved in a blockade. I spontaneously decided to be one of the arrestables. The police took me, but at the end, after a trial, I was completely released from the accusation because it turned out that in Austria, academic freedom is more important than the freedom of drivers to go to work, which is an interest consideration. So after four hours of trial with the head of the police, I was completely freed of my accusation, which is a part of the privilege of being an academic, I would add. Yeah. And this was against the law, but it was not penal law, it was just administrative law. So if I had lost, I just would have to pay 300 euros. Yeah. But this was a way to get also to get in a community of people not feeling completely alone under these conditions. And the fact that also university professor does it, gave it a lot of attention also from public TV. So we've been interviewed by television, why you do it, so to have some time to explain the reasons behind it. And now the last point I wanted to make, the last 20 seconds, is that now you see on the top, EGOS, this is European Group of Organizational Studies, having been elected in the board and then elected chair of the organization, now we started to calculate our own footprint of the conference with the aim to reduce the footprint of our activity by at least 55% by 2030, yeah, which probably is not enough, but nevertheless is a big political issue. If you see calculating the footprint of the conference, most of it comes, 92% comes from people flying to the conference. Yeah, and if you take only the local impact, you see that most of it is on food. Yeah, so we turn all the food vegan and vegetarian. We are trying to find ways to introduce hybrid components. To maybe we will do a conference online and a conference in presence. So it's a big, difficult task, but this is more on this activism on the level of the scientific community. And I'm open to any question you want to have, because there are very political issues, even to make some small changes, like changing the food you offer to people, not to mention telling them to take the train instead of the plane. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Giuseppe. That was, go ahead and put your, can you hear me? You may need to put your earphones back in. Katerina, would you send Giuseppe a message? Or, there you go. Yeah, thank you, Giuseppe, very much. Terrific talk, well received. And let's, we'll have a little time for Q&A after Laura's talk. But feel free to post questions into chat, everyone, or to hold them for later. So let's move on to Laura Horn, the last keynote speaker in this block. Laura is a political economist. Her own research focuses on the political economy of European integration. She teaches global political economy, including ecological economics. In her forthcoming co-edited book, she and her collaborators have written future histories about global politics in the Anthropocene. She's part of Scientist Rebellion Nordic. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks for making it until now here with this workshop. I'm going to share my screen now, which should come up now, hopefully, and just interrupt me if it doesn't work. Sometimes my PowerPoint and Zoom are not very cooperative. So if I keep on talking, but the slides don't move, then just shout at me, please.
Okay.
Thanks for the introduction, Michael. And just to say, there are several people from Scientist Rebellion, of course, in this room. Gianluca, I think, is one of our most active and most central people. I'm with the Nordic group, and I'm also based at the University of Roskilde in Denmark. I am trying to keep my little talk both brief and concrete. That was my task or my mandate for this last contribution to our discussions. And the focus really here I want to bring in, and I hope you can see this next slide, right? Okay.
Yes.
Is kind of reflection and engagement with, well, how do we then navigate the spectrum of academic activism that we've heard about, from citizen science to actual civil disobedience? And I want to share my own perspectives. I'm shamelessly and hopelessly personal here, because there is something, I think there's a boundary here that really keeps a lot of people from getting engaged, because they think, who am I to do something, right? I'm just a person. I'm not a high-level professor. I'm not a seasoned activist who, you know, takes the train to Papua New Guinea as Gianluca has done. I'm just a middle-aged, mid-level academic. I'm also a parent, so I have a lot of constraints. And I think sometimes it's useful to kind of get in and say, okay, how do you navigate that? So I would like to speak to pathways, boundaries, couple of contradictions also, because activism, of course, is not always only a positive experience, and it comes with consequences. And that's why, you know, you need to get over those boundaries, and you need to engage with how far are you willing to go. As example to illustrate this is maybe also to kind of show what happens when you start engaging in activism. The first and then the most recent action we did with the Scientist Rebellion Nordic group. I brought a couple of pictures and I'll walk you through, okay, we did this, and then the most recent thing we did is this, and what happened then, and where's the difference? So broadly, I kind of also want to sort of give you a couple of tools to think about where do I start? Entry points, organization. Of course, I'm in academia. Some of you are in cultural institutions, so there are obviously also institutional and context variables that might be very different, but at the same time, we're talking institutions, right? They are similar to some extent. And we're all professionals with a mainly academic background, many of us in any case. So here, just to say a couple of things about academia, academic activism in practice. Again, mainly university context related, but that can easily be transferred to other institutions here. We've talked already about the relevance of academic activism. This permeates different fields. That can be mainly, we're focused on research, citizen science, but it can also come in when we talk about teaching, right? What is activist teaching? For instance, accepting that what we teach is not neutral. And how do we navigate and deal with that? There's a lot of politicization of that going on. The question of institutional practices we just heard. For instance, the example of the EGOS conference, you know, what you can do, and there's a whole spectrum of things. Sometimes small changes cascade into larger institutional changes. But here the question is, how do we reconcile this with the pressures and expectations and horizons that we in our own professional practices have with those everyday acts of activism? And here I want to throw something into the discussion that I shamelessly borrow from Sarah Ahmed's famous feminist killjoy. Maybe we should all become climate killjoys. What Ahmed means with the feminist killjoy is the one who sort of says, yeah, but I don't find this funny. How can this be? The one who comes into the room and sort of kills the joy by saying, but do we really want to be doing this? That is not comfortable. That is often a very uncomfortable thing to do, whether that's in an everyday situation. Why do we still use this particular brand of tea? Whether that's in the institutional context of a conference, why do we all fly transatlantically to a conference? We could have just done it on Zoom, right? But that takes, again, that goes against boundaries and transgresses. It kills the joy of academia, so to speak. We need to reflect and reposition some of these different roles that we have. And these come, of course, always with power. And again, that comes back to, if you're not the professor, if you're not on a permanent position, then, you know, are you the one who really wants to stick their neck out and do this? I'm very privileged. I have a permanent position now, right? So that kind of gives me privileges that I really do want to push the boundaries of. And then very kind of philosophically here, also, the more I engage with all of this, the more you really have to accept that the notion of the researcher is something that's fully separate from social reality. That is a myth, but more and more, I think we have to understand that it's not just the social reality we're in, but it's a thermodynamic and biosphere reality. I mean, we literally need a stable climate to have a university in the first place. It must not be burning. so to speak. We do actually need water, we need toilets, right? So there's a biophysical reality that we need in order to do research. And there are no professorships on a dead planet. It's a famous line that Charlie Gardner came up with, and I love it. Okay, to walk you through very quickly. I'm part of Scientist Rebellion, which is a group of people organized in local groups doing civil disobedience actions, as well as other actions of activism. You can find some information here. I'm not going to sort of mobilize or try and get you to sign on here, but you're very welcome to do so. Here you can see a couple of pictures of some of the things that we did. We've organized online workshops. We join existing climate demonstrations. We write things specifically in Danish, which is the local language here in Copenhagen, so that we can engage with the public at large and say, look, we are researchers. We say this is not okay. In particular, the actions of our governments are not sufficient. This came out in particular when the Working Group 3 report of the IPCC came out. We said, look at what is happening here. This is not okay. And we put our names on it, right? But to kind of show you the arc of activism and how that develops and what kind of repertoire of action we use, here are two very concrete examples. Our very first proper action took place in October 21. We did a teach-in. And a teach-in is an established form of protest, comes from the Vietnam War and other sort of historical examples, which is not often used anymore. I really do wonder why, because it's perfect for purveyors of knowledge, university, high school educators who literally come and say, you're not listening to the science, we bring the science to you. That's what we did. That was our tagline. We just bring the science to the climate ministry. We also blocked the street outside the climate ministry. It wasn't super high risk because it isn't a super busy street. So we set up a classroom with a couple of chairs. You see them here in the picture on the left. People sat down. We had organized a couple of talks by colleagues, university academics, who could also not stand on the street. So it was safe for them to stand on the pavement, but they all decided to actually move into the street. So that was a transgressive element, but it was safe, right? So it's a very feel-good action, which got a lot of media context. There was a bit of serendipity. It was a beautiful day. It was just after autumn holidays. There wasn't anything else on the news. And we made front page in the Danish media. You can see a picture here. I did not expect that to happen. And we were blown away. And people were like, oh my God, yeah, this makes so much sense. The only props we had were chairs, and I had a piece of chalk. And I was using the pavement, right? So positive, encouraging responses from the media and the politicians. But afterwards, we were blacklisted when we signed up to a conference on fossil fuels. They literally took us. We had already registered and paid. They took us off the participant list. It's in the bottom right corner here. We only wanted to show them academic papers, and we had to stay outside. My own department response was mixed. There were colleagues who said, this is not okay, she can't do this. My university prefers me not to use the name of the university, which is Roskilde University, too much when I speak. And it was also very work intensive and took up a lot of resources. But that's how we started. Where are we now? We have escalated things a little bit. We have, in our last action in May 22, coordinated together with Extinction Rebellion, the Green Student Movement here in Denmark, and lots of other climate groups. We have blocked all the bridges surrounding the Danish parliament. So symbolically, we locked in the politicians so that they had to listen to us. The idea didn't originate with us. That's the beautiful creativity of the climate movements. And that's also something that as an academic activist, you can benefit of that. These people have ideas, right? So we blocked one of the bridges, we did a bit of a street theater, and afterwards we joined the big kind of central blockade in one of the busy bridges in Copenhagen. It was a very creative protest. There was a street blockade. There was super heavy police presence. There were arrests. You see here two pictures in the middle of myself trying to negotiate with the police. They were trying to take my megaphone away from me. That's my megaphone you see there, and it's a beautiful piece of art. I did not expect when I did my PhD that at any point as an academic I would own a megaphone, but that is one of the things I can recommend. Get yourself a megaphone. It makes academic actions very different. So the politicians condemned this action very heavily. And we are now in a situation where we really have to think about what's next. We already escalated, right? So at some point in academic activism, when you come for civil disobedience, there is a kind of moving up the stairs of escalation, which makes it kind of uncomfortable for us to kind of continue doing these things. So just to conclude with a couple of reflections. There are definitely professional development dimensions in terms of consequences of academic activism. Some are positive, some are maybe more ambivalent. You learn a lot because activism means you work together with other people. So I've personally benefited from learning about communication, both media and social media, how to write things in ways that are accessible, how to reach people, how to work together with others. I've learned a lot in terms of tools. I mean, just the fact you all learned about Jamboards today. But I've learned from the activists of how to do things, how to lead things, which is really interesting because usually I don't learn that much from my students, but you know, from the climate activists, that was very, very interesting. I've gained for myself more pedagogical tools to think about my own teaching, but of course there are consequences, right? So whenever I apply for research grants now and they see my name and reviewers might Google me, what they will find is they will find publications and my ORCID and all of that, but they will also find pictures of me that are maybe not the kind of, you know, cool reserved researcher pictures that I would like to outwardly project. I've given up on projecting that, but so there are consequences here. There's also, and this is, I think, something I would like to stress for academics and GLAM professionals, the psychosocial dimensions of activism. Also, the question, should I really spend my time with this? I mean, we're all pressed for time. So let me just to conclude say, yes, you should. Even though reading and following all the research, that's what happens when you're engaged in climate activism. You get much more knowledge, and that is scary. I'm terrified. I often find myself being terrified for my two little kids. It's difficult to balance between the boundaries of academic work, which is a black hole, and activism, which is a black hole. I have no idea how the people who do much more than I do actually manage. And burnout is a real issue, right? So that's really important to keep balances here. But the sheer inspiration and joy that you get from seeing that people care, of the structural things, the long term, people care about each other, people support each other across disciplines, countries, generations, that is worth it, right? Sometimes you get it in academia, but ideally you would get it from both the activist and the academic communities and then pull them both together, and that might just make the difference that we need. I'll stop here. Thanks very much for listening to me.
Wow, Laura, that was tremendous, and Giuseppe and Gianluca as well. I'm sort of, you know, as a human being, sort of blown away by the what you all have shared, and just the humility and directness with which you all shared it, and certainly Margaret and Jérôme and Katerina too, and Stefania.